For taking the time out of your day to watch this video. I'm Warren Porter. I'm the Head of Education Strategy at IMP Software. My background is I was a CFO in a multi-academy trust before joining IMP 3.5 years ago now, and I act as the conduit between what's going on in the sector and understanding what our customers are after, and ensuring that that is translated in a way where our products and our support are developed to solve the challenges that MATs face. I'm joined by my colleague Rosie Holder. Rosie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Warren. I am the MAT product specialist at IMP, and I previously worked as a finance controller within trusts. And at my previous trust, we were a customer of IMP.
Fantastic, thank you. So, MAT Budgeting Clinic, how to achieve a cohesive approach across your schools. If you're watching this, it's likely you're in the middle of or about to begin the budget setting process across your schools, and we've taken the opportunity to bring together some hints and tips from customers and provide some tools to support you during that process. So before I get into things, I'll tell you a little bit about IMP and what we do. IMP, if you've ever wondered, stands for the Integrated MAT Platform, and just over 7 years ago now we launched our IMP Planner product, which is our budgeting, forecasting and reporting tool, focused exclusively on multi-academy trusts. And then a few years after, we released our ICFP module, which is an integrated curriculum financial planning tool and is actually integrated in the sense that the staffing data you see across both your budgeting tool and your curriculum planning tool are one and the same thing. And then more recently, we've launched IMP Finance. So the first part of that went live in September 25. That was the end-to-end purchasing module, and the rest of the finance system is coming in September 26. And what's different about IMP and our unified platform is that all of our products live within the same space. So there aren't actually any integrations between any of these products because they're all singing and looking at the same source of truth. So if I create nominal codes, those nominal codes are instantly visible in our planner tool, our finance tool, our purchasing tool, and they can't be different or they can't be wrong because there are no integrations pushing and pulling data between systems. They are all living within that same ecosystem. We now work with over 550 MATs, 6,500 schools, so we're the preferred choice of planning software within the sector. You may recognise some of the names on here. If you want to know more about IMP, if you're not a customer, then please reach out to us, and always happy to talk about how our products could support with the challenges that you face within your planning process. Also, if you want to look at what customers are saying about us, you can go to Trustpilot and you'll see the types of reviews that customers are leaving about our products, but also our support as well. Into the actual content of this session now. We know that budgeting in MATs is really, really hard, and it's a process that involves timelines that need to be hit, lots of stakeholder involvement, whether that's finance teams, whether that's people on the ground in schools like head teachers, lots of moving parts, changing assumptions, and the likelihood of this is those of you that are watching this webinar are probably the ones that are having to manage this process, and from experience I know that's not easy. So this session is designed to highlight some of the hints and tips taken from our customers for budget setting to ensure that the fundamentals are achieved and that this is coordinated effectively across your group of schools, across your entire MAT. Some of this you may feel is teaching you how to suck eggs, but you may get one thing that's useful, 10 things that are useful, but at the very least, as we enter that budget setting time in the year, it gets those cogs going again, and we know it's a long time between budget setting cycles, so a little bit of rust can start to creep in. So hopefully it gets you to start thinking about these things again as you enter that planning cycle. The Academy Trust Handbook, that lovely document that you all have beside your bedside table, and the reason I'm flagging this is that the DfE are pretty prescriptive with their approach to the internal control framework. They have musts and shoulds, and we know that if it's a must, then it's a non-negotiable. You have to do this thing to be compliant. And the point I've highlighted in yellow is that there's an expectation that MATs coordinate the planning and budgeting process, and therefore there is somebody who needs to be accountable, people that are responsible for making sure that that budget planning process across all schools and the central locations in the trust is coordinated centrally. And it's like I say, a job that that you're probably having to do, or someone that you work closely with is having to do, and that's where we come in to try and support with these types of pieces of work that you're having to manage across your trusts. So in terms of the agenda for this session, there's three core parts. There's the top budgeting tips when preparing your budgets. Rosie's going to cover those. There's the top tips when you're reviewing your budgets. And then there's the top level overview of our MAT budgeting checklist. And this is a free resource that we provide to the sector to help you with some of those key things you're having to think about and do during that budget setting cycle, and to help with the coordination of that across all of your schools.
The first section that we're focusing on is that budget preparation and looking at the decisions and processes that should be in place before your schools start to formally submit their numbers. So thinking about your pupil numbers then, they are the most important driver of your income line. If you get that part wrong, then your budgets are already starting on that unreliable foundation. So we would encourage you to start drawing on every data source that's available. So that might be your own admissions data, your LA projections or birth rate trends that you might have in your catchment area. And the more evidence driven that your figures are, the better that those assumptions are going to be. And don't forget to consider things like your pupil characteristics too, so things like SEND or free school meal children, because those will not only affect your core funding, but those pupil numbers will affect any of your additional grants as well. So think about those pupil numbers too. Moving on to staffing decisions then. So these should be driven by your forward-looking curriculum and not just by what maybe the school has delivered historically. So this is more of a mindset shift that makes a real difference when you're setting that budget. Traditionally, I think, we saw that budgets were being set from top down. You were starting with your financial constraints and then working backwards from that. But actually, if your curriculum plan is the starting point, that staffing model is then grounded on what you're trying to deliver educationally. So your budget is then reflecting your reality rather than potentially historic information. So what we'd like to see here is, your curriculum leads, your finance colleagues, having those conversations to start updating any assumptions as they change. It will be an iterative process, but framing the budget that way means that every financial decision is coming back to your core purpose, be that for the school or for the trust. Here we'd say get ahead of those recruitment needs by mapping any of those starters and leavers, potential parental leaves, map them early because we know that recruitment is constantly moving in the sector. You might have lots of turnover within schools. So building in that proactive staff plan means that it's already aligned to your curriculum needs, as we said in the previous slide. So you've got ahead of any of those anticipated changes that might be coming. And that means you can move quickly when you need to, so you're avoiding the cost and the disruption that might come with those potentially unexpected vacancies that arise. A small change in your pay award assumptions can have a huge impact in your budgets. So making sure that you're communicating with peers, find out what are they budgeting for with their staff assumptions and look at the guidance that's out there. So that might be from maybe ASCL briefings or maybe the STRB offers to arrive at a well-documented assumption. I mean, the key word that we've put on here is sensible. So it's not optimistic, it's not pessimistic, it's a sensible, evidence-based assumption that's clearly then being recorded to refer back to. Ultimately, your assumptions are often a guess, which obviously makes the planning process quite tricky. Even people watching this webinar, I think, will have varying assumptions across the trusts on things like pay awards. And ultimately, someone in this room will be wrong, and that's okay because that's the nature of that forward planning. So these assumptions are formed on judgment and opinions and whatever information we could find from out there. So it can even be informed by, I suppose, your trust's approach to risk, and maybe the context that you've got within your trust will also play a part in those assumptions. So what we're suggesting here is using what-if analysis to start, I suppose, helping you understand, well, if things are slightly different, what are the risks and what are the opportunities? And how can we get ahead of that to mitigate it and make the best use of those potential opportunities? As you can see here, we've said, the GAG is confirmed in year one, but actually the future year assumptions need to be carefully thought out and they need to be shared consistently across schools. Beyond GAG, you need to consider maybe how you're treating the other funding streams. So that could be things like PE and sports premium, pupil premium, will they continue and at what level will they continue? If you've got different schools in your trust using different assumptions for the same funding streams, that consolidated picture that you get is ultimately going to be less reliable. So making sure that we agree and communicate those central assumptions with the schools is then one of the most important coordination tasks you've got at the start of that budget setting cycle. Often we see schools can overlook incremental pay progression. So particularly around maybe teachers that might be moving from MPS 6 up to UPS 1. If you have lots of those errors, it can actually creep up quite quickly of the monetary value of that. So if maybe you've forgotten to mark a teacher moving into the upper pay scale, it's not reflected in the budget, it's underestimating the costs, and then that gap is ultimately going to show in your bottom line. So this is a good chance to start reviewing any of those transitions, and at the same time to review any of those additional responsibility payments. So things like maybe TLRs or SEN allowances. Is your budget still aligned to your current staffing structure and that curriculum design? Have we got roles that have changed and does the budget reflect that? So it's quite a nice chance to go through and update that staffing piece. Most schools will have, expected staff turnover, and the cost differential between leavers and their replacements can be quite a meaningful budget difference. So if you're expecting, let's say, 2 UPS 3 teachers to leave and they're being replaced by 2 MPS 6 colleagues, there's a net saving there that you need to plan for and, potentially redeploy. So factor in that natural churn and giving you a more accurate costing for those future years avoids that situation where potentially a school's budgeting on the assumption that every leaver is going to be replaced on the same pay point, which probably isn't realistic. Understanding those non-funding calculated assumptions. So non-staffing costs obviously make up a substantial proportion of your budget, and they deserve the same attention that you're using on your pay lines. So things like your energy and premises and insurance, and thinking about the assumptions around those. So those budgets can be informed by external data. So actually, have we looked at inflation forecasts? Have we looked at the utility trends and supplier contract renewals? And this should all be feeding into your assumptions. And then we can agree and communicate that at a trust level to the schools before the schools start their detailed budget planning. So if you're sharing those assumptions centrally, you're then going to get better quality budget assumptions from the schools, which means you're likely to have fewer rounds of that revision process where you're reiterating the budgets. So this point probably sounds quite obvious, but it's an easy point to miss. So your brought forward balance is the starting point for your reserves position. And without that accurate view of your 25-26 outturn, essentially you're setting a target that you can't then measure against. So you should be working with your schools to pin down the latest forecast for the current year. And that's then the foundation that everything else is then going to be sat on. I'll hand over to Warren for the budget review top tips.
The elements that Rosie just ran through are around budget preparation, and that's about getting you to a V1 draft of your budget, where I use the word completeness. You've got everything you need in your budget to start to review the actual numbers. And the elements I'm going to run through now are, post us getting to a V1 of that budget, what sorts of things should we be looking at, should we be reviewing to help us iterate on and refine our budgets to get to a point where we're happy pre-approval by local governing bodies and the trust board. And there isn't it's not a case of these things run sort of during separate timescales. As you get to a point where you're ready to review, likelihood is you'll need to come back to some of those preparation steps to continue to iterate and work on your budgets. But there is a line between getting to a V1 budget where you've got everything you need to actually review the data and then to have those conversations if there are any challenges you need to solve, and talk about resource optimization. So once you're at that point, these are the top tips that our customers have been giving us. So comparing your 2026-27 draft budget to the latest 25-26 outturn to identify differences that should be considered. And where this becomes really helpful is this will help you to identify where you've got things within your current forecast, so the forecast for the current year, that might be missing or overstated or understated in future years. So if you've got actuals or forecasts for the current year for, let's say, licenses or subscriptions, and you compare that to next year's budget and you can see that they're missing, well, the question would be, is that a recurrent spend? Is that going to happen again in the future? And it's about capturing those things that are going to appear in your budgets in the future, so you've got a realistic view of your income and expenditure. And it comes back to that word I use a lot, completeness. So making sure that you've caught everything within the budget to give you that realistic view of where you're heading. Budget review tip 2. So understanding your year-on-year staffing changes and ensuring increases are in line with your ICFP requirements. So this will be looking at, I guess, as a first point, are there any FTE movement? So we'll put down, and it's worth doing this by different staffing roles as well, so teachers, TAs, and so on. So have you got any road contracts that haven't been ended, any vacancies that are missing? Actually, where we're seeing these fluctuations in FTEs, does this align to our curriculum plans? If we said that we've got a falling pupil role in this primary school and we need to reduce staff FTE in the future, can we see teaching FTE going down in our budgets? And I know it's not as straightforward as that, but it's about aligning what the curriculum offer is and those drivers there with your actual staffing in your budgeting tool. And yeah, making sure that it does match expectations from a curriculum point of view versus what's in your budget. So top tip 3, reviewing SRM KPIs against national and trust school specific benchmarking data. So using comparisons where you drive towards a norm or an average are not helpful, as there might be a reason why you're different. So understanding how to use comparisons and benchmarking is really important. It's not a case of management by metric and saying you need to be the same as this type of school, but it's about spotting outliers between schools and similar schools from maybe national data sets or other school peers, if you can get that data, and then applying that context and asking those questions. So does this feel right? Are we okay with this being different? Is there a better approach to benchmarking? Or a better approach to managing and deploying our resources within particular schools. A school may have decided to have less but more expensive teachers, and therefore having a higher contact ratio is fine. If that's deliberate and the compromises are understood, then, is this okay potentially? So it's not a case of it makes the decisions for you when you start to compare your data for a school or across your trust against similar schools, but it's just making sure that you understand the context and the reasons why things are different. Analysing per pupil spend on all expenditure lines and pupil adult ratios for all roles. Again, benchmarking this with other trust schools. So this is about internal benchmarking. When we look at per pupil metrics, these can be some of the best comparisons because it puts it into a relative comparison. So comparing a number for a big school versus a small school in terms of, let's say, curriculum spend at an absolute level is probably not okay, because you'd expect the big school to have more spend. But then if you look at it on a per pupil basis, it shows you by pupil, are we spending more or less in this area? And again, you can support with some of those conversations. Also, you start to understand your school improvement goals for each school. So the condition of the estate, pupil demographics, and therefore this will likely form part of the conversation around why things look different. So that's some of the budget review tips that we've taken from customers. The next part is running through our IMP budget template, and we build this and roll this out to non-IMP customers. And IMP customers can already do these things within the system, but we try to be helpful where we can. So if you're not an IMP customer, you can use this spreadsheet to help with that coordination piece from the centre across all of your schools. So it's not a one-stop shop for everything budgeting, but it may provide some useful things to help you coordinate your planning process. I'm now going to bring that up on screen. So you can download this resource for free, and there are a number of different tabs that I'll talk through. So we have the MAT instructions. So in the first instance, when you download this spreadsheet as a MAT Central finance person, the idea is that you prime the workbook so that you can then take this and roll it out to schools based on the things that are important and the context for your trust. So these MAT instructions here tell you what you need to do on each of these tabs to help you get this ready before you roll this out to schools. So the idea is you'd create one version of this, you'd make the tweaks based on your trust context, and then once you're happy with that version, you'd save it down and you'd share this with all schools, so all schools are using the same consistent approach to your budget planning. In terms of the school instructions, these are the instructions within this tab that you define for what the schools need to do within each tab. So for example, on pupil numbers, we're saying to schools, add your pupil numbers in for your October census, and where applicable, your UIFSM data from the January census. So pupil numbers in future years are driven by a formula. These are your instructions. So we've given some outline instructions that you might want to use, but if you in the central team are responsible for adding in pupil numbers, then you might want to change this instruction so it's very clear to schools, and these flow through into the other tabs. So if I look at the timeline tab, you put your school name in here. So for each school, you want to save this workbook down, and you want to put that school's name in there, and then you'll put your dates in here. So this is around the timeline of the budget planning process. You receive gag statements; these need to be input by this date. Curriculum plans and first draft staffing structures need to be done between these dates here. Again, these are your timelines. The school instructions that you put in here telling schools what to do in here will flow from that school instructions tab. And once you've done the priming of the workbook and sorting this out for your sort of master version that you're going to roll out to schools, you'd then go through and delete these columns of data in here, so it's just the school instructions that the schools would see. We've got pupil numbers as well. So in here we tried to be really helpful, where you can put your projected pupil numbers in at each census point, and these will roll forward. So if I said, based on our October 25 census, that our pupil numbers are 56, you'll see that then this will roll down into future years as well. So it's that staircasing approach. But if I want to say in this year, those numbers actually need to be 52, you can overwrite that formula as well. So you have flexibility there. We've also got some pupil numbers to include, which will help to calculate pupil premium funding and also UIFSM funding as well. And all of these numbers in here can be taken from the census, maybe other sources, and you can pop them in here. You can let them roll forward into future years, or you can change those numbers if you don't want to use the formula to do that work for you. On funding rates, try to be helpful and update the latest rates where we can. But ultimately, for those funding streams that we're calculating, these rates will be used to join, or these rates will be used in combination with the pupil numbers to calculate those funding streams that are added into your budget. So we've got this a pupil premium, PINGA sports grant, UIFSM. There may be other funding rates that we're not calculating the actual funding amount for in this template, but it might be actually school. When you're calculating your early years funding, you need to use £8.90 per hour, and we give you the ability to add in these funding rates so that they can see what the top level assumptions are that you want to use for your schools. It may be that you have a version for certain groups of schools because they're in different LAs, or it might be you've got one version and you say for NCC the rate is this, And for DCC, the rate is this. So again, that's a choice that you can make. We've also got some links to the DFE guidance for these as well. So if you want to go and cross-reference the rates, then you can do that as well. Remember, these are your rates. We've tried to give you a helpful starter for 10. You can change any assumptions within any future years as well. And then we have the other assumptions page. So this is for anything that's not funding related, or anything that doesn't sit naturally within that funding rates tab that you want to include in here. And again, these are just about putting a set of standardized assumptions in here so that there's one source of the truth, one version of assumptions that all schools are using. So what's our teacher staff inflationary pay increase that you want them to bake into the budgeting model? What's our RPA rate per pupil? What's our funding assumptions around pension increases? We know that the pension rates for the support staff LGPS pension scheme, that's changing from April 26, so making sure that you're being very clear and communicating what the latest rates are to use in each of these areas. And then we have given you the ability to calculate staff churn. So I've said I'm going to add in 2 FTE. The average cost of a staff leaver is £80,000. The average cost of a replacement is £45,000. Therefore, I need to bake in £70,000 of it's not income but negative staff costs to say this is what we expect the staff churn amount to be, and this is something that can be done individually by each school when you give them the template. Once you've done all of that work to create that master document or master spreadsheet, you can then save that down and roll it out to schools, and we have this summary tab, and for each school they'll be able to see their funded pupil numbers. They'll be able to see the grant values that are being calculated, so they can take these and they can add this into the budgeting tool. Same with those staff churn amounts, and then those assumptions that you've listed, we've summarized those below. So you can say to them, you need to be using these assumptions when you're creating your budgets. And we've got a nice Gantt chart view of those timescales, so you can see the key things that need to be done during your budget setting cycle and how that looks from a timeline perspective, just to help people understand the key dates within your budget setting cycle. And then finally, we have this budget setting checklist tab, and this is where you can put in here specifics around the things that need to be done during the budget setting cycle. So not necessarily the top level timetable, but real detail around what you need to do during the preparation stage, what's the target date for that, again, what you want them to do during the review stage. And then once they've completed this, they can put the completed date in. You can also put a review date in, and the people that are completing it can put their name there. The people that are reviewing it can stick their name there. They're responsible for the review date columns. Person completing is responsible for the completed date columns. And then the idea is that for each school, you end up at a point where all of this work has been done, completed, ideally on time and by the target date, but you've got that full review process in place. Again, these are things that we've outlined here to try and help you with, to give you a starter in terms of the things that you might want people to be covering during the cycle. But you can add rows into here, you can change things, you can do what you want. It's your work, but we've just tried to give you a starting point to help you with this. We're always looking to update this information, so you can email us at hello@impsoftware.co.uk if you think there's anything useful that we can add to this. Any other top tips around preparation or reviewing as well, please share this with us. And if you want to talk more around how IMP can help you with your with your systems to support your planning and financial management, then please get in contact with us, and always happy to have a chat about that. I'll finish by saying thank you to Rosie, and hopefully you find the content that we've run through today useful, and the Excel workbook, you can use that and use it in practice and make it practical for you, and support with the coordination of that planning process, which we know is pretty tricky. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for watching this, and hopefully speak soon.
Thanks everyone.